Lecture 13. Eleanor of Aquitaine gets a divorce.
Welcome back. In our last lecture, we discussed the Battle of Aquitaine, an event that in 1187 proved the disastrous turning point for European crusading dreams in the Middle East. The Crusader kingdoms that had been established in the Levant in the late 11th and early 12th centuries were, for all intents and purposes, conquered, destroyed, or captured by the great Muslim leader Saladin, who had been thorough in his military efforts, but had shown great mercy to those he had conquered. Aquitaine was the conclusion to a decades-long struggle as the European Christian territories in the Holy Land, or Outre-mer, had been under threat from the very moment of their creation. In 1145, 40-some years before Aquitaine, the Second Crusade had been called in an attempt to shore up the Crusader position in the Middle East. Those who heeded the call this time around included an even greater array of very high-ranking nobles than had participated in the First Crusade. Those heading out for the Holy Land on this occasion included several heads of state. Among them, King Louis VII of France, who was accompanied by his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the subject of today's lecture. As you might imagine from the title of today's lecture, the turning point under discussion here has to do with the theme of personality, which we've explored in a number of lectures so far. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a key figure in the medieval world, first because of her status as the heiress to the largest duchy in the region we today think of as France. Aquitaine was in the south, which had a very different personality than the north. In the south, women had more power and influence than they did in the north, and they lived in a world of greater sensual pleasures, especially when it came to music, poetry, and romantic love, than did the more austere, piously Christian people to the north. In part, this may have been due to long contact between the south of France and Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus, which we've already seen was a most unusual society in terms of its religious and cultural tolerance, emphasis on education, and appreciation for the arts, music, literature, art, fashion, architecture, and the like. So as the eldest child of her father, lacking brothers, being heir to a huge swath of territory, and being raised in the rather liberal culture of the Aquitaine, another word for the south of France at that time, Eleanor seemed bound to play a role of some significance in the medieval world. For one thing, she was very desirable as a spouse, as any man who married her would gain significant status and power by attaining control over Aquitaine. So it was no surprise that when still a young girl, she was wed to Louis, son of King Louis VI of France. What was a surprise is what happened next. Unhappy in her marriage, she did something about it. She obtained a divorce, giving up her position as Queen of France and the care of her two young daughters. She then married Henry Plantagenet, a great-grandson of William the Conqueror and son of the Empress Matilda, who, for years, had been struggling to secure her right to rule England in the face of opposition from her cousin Stephen, who claimed the throne for himself. Eleanor's actions, before, during, and after her second marriage, caused quite a scandal and were regarded as quite astonishing at the time. However, Eleanor's divorce, shocking as it was in many respects, was not, at the time, recognized for what it really meant, the turning point it would really turn out to be. It was only some years later that the world began to appreciate what her decision to leave her first husband had set into motion. If Eleanor had not initiated a divorce with Louis VII and then chosen Henry Plantagenet as her next husband, the history of the medieval West, particularly in France and England, would have been much different. I've used this metaphor before, but it really is appropriate to use it again in this instance. Eleanor's divorce set off a ripple effect that was still being felt centuries later. It changed not only the shape of nations and affected later military conflicts, but it also impacted the cultural traditions of these countries as well. Literary traditions, royal inheritance customs, and more. And while this was indeed first in large measure because of an accident of birth, Eleanor was born in Aquitaine and became heir to those lands, it was secondly, and more emphatically, because of Eleanor's personality and force of will. Another personality born into the same circumstances might well have done nothing, or at least done what was typical in a royal marriage at this time: keep quiet and accept one's lot. But there was absolutely nothing typical about Eleanor. One could say with some authority that there had never been a woman like her in all the medieval world, and there wouldn't be any other woman who would come close until Elizabeth I of England came to the throne in the 16th century. So how did this remarkable woman arrive at the moment that would cause her to create one of the most dramatic turning points of the Middle Ages? And why, with all the shock and scandal her behavior caused at the time, did the rest of the medieval world not glimpse the full potential of her actions until much later? To understand that, we have to go back a bit to Eleanor's grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, also known as the Troubadour Duke. The troubadour tradition arguably plays a very large role in Eleanor's story, so we need to understand what that tradition is. Simply put, it was a genre of musical poetry that emphasized not only romantic love, but also the idolization of women. Also sometimes known as fin d'amour, it was a tradition in which poets sang songs of their utter devotion to a particular lady. In some cases, this was to curry favor with a woman who happened to be ruling over a certain territory, something that wasn't so unusual in the south of France. In other instances, the declaration of love and devotion to a lady was a way to try and get close to a particular lord, the lady's husband. The idea here was that the devotion, while absolute, was also chaste. Attainment of one's object of affection would be endlessly deferred, the better to inspire poets to create more songs and knights to fight more valiantly to impress their chosen ladies. Some scholars refer to this phenomenon as courtly love, the placing of a lady on a pedestal so as to make her utterly unattainable and thus endlessly inspirational. Or, as one of my students once commented, a really big waste of time. But this was the culture of the ducal court of Poitou in Aquitaine, where Eleanor grew up. And though she never knew her grandfather, his fame as a glamorous warrior and lusty composer of love songs would certainly have been known to her. Known to her, too, was that he was a famous adulterer. He crossed the line and turned his words of love into deeds, openly committing adultery. He was also, even more significantly for the time, not terribly religious. Some might say, in fact, that he was anti-clerical. He seemed to have little use for religion and even less respect for the church's moral edicts, making William the Troubadour Duke one of the most unusual nobles of the time. Like father, like son. Eleanor's father, Duke William X, regularly found himself embroiled in battles with important figures in the church hierarchy, and, like his father before him, the new duke had large appetites and was perfectly comfortable flouting church strictures. William's brother, Raymond, was one of those younger sons we discussed in our lecture on the First Crusade. Desiring to keep the Duchy of Aquitaine and the power that came with it intact, the Troubadour Duke left everything to his eldest son, William X, and Raymond had to find his own way in the world. He did this by joining the Crusades and carving out his own territory in the Holy Land. This would turn out to be a significant factor in Eleanor's divorce, as we shall see. Now, it's important to remember that France in the 12th century little resembled the France of today. In effect, the French kings ruled directly over territories closest to Paris, the Île-de-France, and most other lands, such as Brittany and Normandy, were largely independent, even if nominally held by dukes who were officially vassals of the French king. The acquisition of the Duchy of Aquitaine by the French crown meant that France practically doubled in size overnight. Thus, it was no surprise that Eleanor ended up married to the future King of France. It was also no surprise that the marriage did not go as smoothly as one might have hoped, although, on the surface of it, it probably seemed like a better match than many among the royals of Europe, who always married for political and economic advantage. If love happened in a royal marriage, it would be an unexpected benefit. But in the case of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, it really did seem like a possibility. In a significant departure from many royal marriages, in this case, the parties were of similar ages when they wed. Both were teenagers. But although the marriage seemed initially successful, there were simply too many obstacles to its ultimate success. Eleanor was a Southerner and regarded with some hostility by many of the members of the court in the North. They found her manners unbecoming for what they considered a pious Christian queen. Eleanor, for her part, was accustomed to a world in which women could speak their minds and in which church teachings condemning women as the source of original sin were blithely ignored in favor of troubadour love lyrics. At first, it seems that Eleanor's strong personality would be what directed the marriage. But Louis could never shake or overcome the deeply religious upbringing and education he had had. For you see, Louis, like Eleanor's uncle Raymond, had been a second son and thus destined for the church. He only became the heir to the throne when his older brother Philip was killed in a freak horseback riding accident. Deeply pious, it seems that Louis got little joy out of life. Although Eleanor provided him with 2 children, both daughters, he came to see the lack of a son as a condemnation from God for having a wife so out of step with the mores of the very Christian French court. It is this piety, it seems clear, that led Louis to join the Second Crusade to the Holy Land, which set out in 1147. It is Eleanor's appetite for adventure, it also seems clear, that led her to decide that she would come along for the ride. Now, it was not unheard of for wives to accompany husbands on their military pilgrimages to Outremer, but it was unusual, and Eleanor's experience as a woman on crusade was perhaps the most unusual of all. For it was while engaged in this religious activity that she decided she wanted out of the marriage. Not only did she decide, she announced it to her husband and suggested they appeal to the Pope for an annulment on grounds of consanguinity immediately upon their return from the Middle East. What happened is this. After a long journey to the Levant, which included a stopover in Byzantium, the royal party arrived in Antioch, which was now ruled over by Eleanor's uncle, Raymond, who had done quite well for himself. Just 9 years older than Eleanor, Raymond was reportedly delighted to see his niece. Indeed, very soon after their arrival, the gossip was that he was a little too delighted. The rumor quickly spread that the French queen and the ruler of Antioch were engaged in an incestuous affair. Whether or not this rumor is true cannot be verified one way or another, and in some respects, it doesn't matter whether or not it actually happened. What mattered is that plenty of people in Louis's entourage thought it did. Raymond had attempted to recruit Louis and his followers to a particular plan of attack to support Christian interests in the Middle East. Louis didn't like Raymond's plan of retaking the county of Edessa. He thought an attack on Jerusalem, a direct approach, was the way to go. Another woman, another queen, might have meekly bitten her tongue, shook her head, and seethed silently inside, all the while keeping to herself the opinion that her husband was making a horrible mistake. Eleanor was not any woman. Fed up by this point with a husband she found at once too meek when it came to politics and too overbearing and cold when it came to marriage, she told him to take himself off to Jerusalem while she would remain behind and plan the annulment of their marriage. But for all his faults and his grating piety, Louis did love Eleanor. In fact, he loved her so much that many in his entourage found it troubling, concerned that Louis too often had been swayed by Eleanor's desires. The experience while en crusade would prove to be the nail in the coffin of the royal marriage, and it was not long after their return to France that the Pope granted the couple a divorce, an annulment, really, on the basis that they had been too closely related to marry in the first place, a common technicality used by nobles to escape unpleasant, inconvenient, or childless marriages. The end of the marriage was shocking enough. One can imagine that all the medieval world was agog that a woman like Eleanor wouldn't want to be Queen of France, and stunned equally that Louis wouldn't have done everything possible to keep Eleanor as his wife and thus Aquitaine as part of his possessions. But what was even more shocking was what Eleanor did next, and here we come at last to the turning point which, while noteworthy at the time, was not fully appreciated for its full significance until much later. For within just a few weeks of receiving confirmation of her annulment, Eleanor herself wrote a letter to young Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy, declaring herself free to marry if he would have her. Eleanor, almost a decade older than the young Duke, had previously been married 15 years, producing only daughters and no sons. From a political standpoint, she seemed not a wise match for an ambitious young noble like Henry. But he said yes with alacrity. Some scholars have attempted to explain the haste of Eleanor's remarriage as a necessity. As the greatest single heiress in the land, she was likely to be the object of attempted kidnappings and forced marriages, and so, many reason, she needed to make a strong marriage, and quickly, to protect herself and her interests. But it seems more likely, as unbelievable as it might be in the medieval world, that this was in fact a love match. Eleanor and Henry had met during treaty negotiations between Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, and the French crown in 1151. It seems that they both made an impression on one another at this initial meeting. And when she was free, Eleanor went after what she wanted, and she got it. The marriage between the two greatly increased Henry's holdings, and more importantly, greatly increased his holdings along the border with Louis VII's kingdom. It must have been galling to Louis to have his difficult bride, whom he had certainly loved, leave him, and then remarry a man whose family had been at odds and at war with his own. But no one knew just yet how significant, what a turning point this marriage would be. Because although his mother had long claimed her right to the English throne, it looked not at all certain that she would prevail. Henry, it seemed likely, would live out his life as Duke of Normandy and co-ruler of Aquitaine with his new wife. But then King Stephen, who had long claimed the throne of England in opposition to Henry's mother Matilda, suffered a blow when his eldest son Eustace died. He had a second son, William, but he was far too young to rule on his own. Stephen reached an agreement with his cousin and her family. He would remain King of England until his death, but he would name Henry Plantagenet as his heir. And in 1154, Henry, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and Duke of Aquitaine, became King of England as well. Henry was now ruler of a huge collection of territories that scholars have come to call the Angevin Empire. Over time, he would expand his holdings still further, adding Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to the domains over which he held sway. The power shift that had occurred between France and the Plantagenet line with Henry's marriage to Eleanor suddenly became even more pronounced, and Louis's status in the medieval theater of politics was much diminished. It was a shift that would sow ill will and conflict between the two neighboring countries for centuries to come. Ultimately, we can trace the 100 Years' War between France and England, which lasted, incidentally, 116 years, back to the turning point of Eleanor's marriage to Henry. The Wars of the Roses, which consumed much of England in the later 15th century, also can be traced, in some of its elements, back to the moment when huge territories in France and England were united on the occasion of the union of Henry Plantagenet and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And again, these ultimate results, these ripples down through time, were due to the remarkable nature of Eleanor, not just in her personality, but in her physical person as well. During her marriage to Henry, she would bear him no fewer than 8 children, and possibly as many as 10 or more. This was at a time when pregnancy and childbirth were the most dangerous of experiences for women. Eleanor survived at least 11 pregnancies, and what's more, she was busy traveling back and forth across the Channel and overseeing matters in her realm of Aquitaine during most of it. What's even more astonishing is that almost all her children not only made it out of early childhood, but grew up to marry and have children of their own. This at a time when infant mortality rates were hovering anywhere between 50 to 80%. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not only a most unusual personality, but she was also arguably the healthiest person in the medieval world. The fact that she seemed to pass this quality on to her children was both good and bad. As we saw earlier, Louis had been concerned with the fact that Eleanor had been unable to provide him with the desperately needed son and heir. When it came to Henry, Eleanor provided him with a few too many, a fact that would come back to trouble the Plantagenet line in the future. Henry had learned the lesson that Eleanor's grandfather, the troubadour duke, had also known. Breaking up land diminishes power. Better to leave one son immense power, wealth, and status, and the other son nothing, than to give each child an equal but diminished portion. Henry and Eleanor had 4 sons who survived into adulthood. To the eldest, also named Henry, the throne of England was to go. The elder Henry wanted to assure this, so he actually had his son crowned as, quote-unquote, the young king while he was still alive. The second son, Richard, would receive the Duchy of Aquitaine, whole and entire, a solution that would preserve the bulk of English power and status and also give Richard a respectable inheritance and significant territory to govern. For Geoffrey, the third son, Henry and Eleanor arranged a marriage to the heiress of Brittany, another solution to the problem of providing for multiple sons. But to the youngest, John, nothing. The kingdom could not be divided further without significantly diminishing its power. Soon John was given the taunting nickname Lackland. To Henry's credit, this seems to have been of some concern to him, and may, in fact, be why he pushed so aggressively into Ireland later in his reign. He wanted to have something to leave each of his sons, and if he could acquire Ireland, he could then give it away again. For a while, all seemed well. There was clearly genuine affection between Henry and Eleanor, and they ruled well together, with Henry trusting her to act in his stead, particularly when it came to territories such as Aquitaine. The marriage began to go south around 1168, however. As she had demonstrated in both her marriages, while you could take the girl out of Aquitaine, you could not take the Aquitaine out of the girl. Eleanor and her southern ways had been the subject of much scandal and gossip in the court of France, and she met with a similar reaction at the English court when she crossed the Channel and became Henry's wife. Still, her impact on English society was mostly positive, especially culturally speaking. She is often credited with bringing troubadour culture and a joyful, sensual literary tradition with her across the Channel, and she brought with her, too, many French customs that seemed foreign and strange at first, but which were quickly adopted by her new subjects. Putting tapestries on the floor of her chambers seems to be one such innovation many commented upon, but in the cold, drafty palaces in an English winter, this began to seem like a rather good idea. After the birth of their last child, John, Eleanor returned to Poitou in Aquitaine and spent most of the next 5 years there. It seems that her time there brought back pleasant memories of her childhood, and she found herself identifying more and more with her subjects there, many of whom had been at odds and in open conflict with Henry at one time or another. The marriage began to fray. There were several factors adding to the stresses on the union of these two powerful individuals. It seems clear now that while Eleanor believed that Aquitaine should always go its own way and not simply be absorbed into Henry's empire, Henry himself had not always thought this way. Richard, Eleanor's favorite son, was being groomed for the position of Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor intended to keep his inheritance intact. Henry seemed to favor John above his other sons, and his desire to procure some holding or inheritance for the youngest irritated John's older brothers. Henry, the young king, in particular, was finding his life increasingly intolerable. Although crowned as king-to-be, he had no real duties, no real responsibility, and increasingly chafed at the fact that his younger brothers, Richard and Geoffrey, were ruling their own realms while he whiled away his days in tournaments and jousting, having nothing else to do. And in 1170, Thomas Becket, formerly Henry's best friend and also the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered in the cathedral itself, chased down by 4 of Henry's knights who thought the Archbishop's death was what the king wanted, a fact which brought negative feeling against the king. Things were not going well for Henry. And here, once again, is where Eleanor's divorce from Louis VII would have such dramatic repercussions. In 1173, Eleanor's sons decided they were dissatisfied with their father's behavior, and with Eleanor's blessing and urging, took up arms against their father. Henry the young king went to Paris to seek the support of his father-in-law, who was none other than Louis, his mother's former husband. The French king must have taken some delight in acting as a new father figure to his rival's son. When Henry sent messengers to call his son back, Louis told them, quote, "The king of the English is here. The former king should correct his habit of conducting himself as king after having resigned his kingdom in favor of his son, as all the world bears witness." End quote. Such a statement was tantamount to declaring war between France and England. Furious that Eleanor had supported their sons against him, Henry had her captured and held under house arrest for the next 16 years. During this time, Henry struggled to control his vast territories and sought to resolve tensions with his sons. In 1183, the young king, Henry's namesake, died of dysentery, begging for his father's forgiveness on his deathbed and asking also that Henry be kind to Eleanor. After this, Eleanor's house arrest seemed to have eased somewhat, although she was still closely monitored. When Henry II finally died in 1189, Richard, now his heir, gave orders for his mother to be immediately released from her captivity. One might think that after all she had lived through, Eleanor of Aquitaine would be happy with a quiet widowhood. Far from it. She spent her time negotiating Richard's marriage, dealing with additional threats from France, and securing Richard's release from the prison of Philip II of France, who had captured the English king as he was returning from the Third Crusade. The bad blood between the two countries would remain. Eleanor outlived almost all her children, including King Richard the Lionheart. She died in 1204, aged around 80, well into the reign of her youngest son, John, he who had once been called Lackland. As we'll see in a later lecture on the Magna Carta, John's nickname would prove to be prophetic, as even though he surprisingly ended up inheriting control over the whole Angevin Empire, poor political decisions on John's part would mean that he would lose almost everything his father had won and more, and ultimately he was forced to accept the Magna Carta, drawn up by a group of disgruntled barons. Perhaps if Eleanor had not been so fertile and had not had so many surviving children, the events of the Magna Carta would never have come to pass. Eleanor's divorce and remarriage and the power and status she had brought to bear in arranging marriages for all her children dramatically reshaped the European political scene. If Eleanor had not divorced her first husband, France would have been a much more significant power in the 12th century than it was, and England a much lesser one. The shift of power that her marriage effected sowed the seeds of conflict that would have repercussions well into the modern period. If Eleanor was larger than life, casting everything around her into shadow, the main player in our next lecture introduced to medieval Europe an innovation so astonishing and profoundly significant that his story was quickly overshadowed by the knowledge he shared with the medieval world. In 1202, an Italian merchant named Leonardo of Pisa translated a text out of Arabic and into Latin. The Liber Abaci, or Book of the Abacus, as it was called, introduced Arabic numerals and basic algebra to the Italian peninsula. From there, it was swiftly adopted by those in banking, trade, and commerce, and any profession in which working with numbers was essential. The cumbersome Roman numeral system was out, and the economy of the medieval world was given a significant boost by a more efficient and reliable system of keeping accounts and doing math. Join us next time as we examine this remarkable text and its origins in greater detail.